and in celebrating as well the 500 years of Christianity as at the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, who be forever and amen. In the name of the Father, the Holy Spirit, amen. So, okay. So, to start, let me just give a few reminders. This not require any registration prior to attending necessary distractions. We would discourage you keeping your video on to not consume too much bandwidth allocation. Each day has a designated moderator, which is me, Jillian, and Andre, and we will monitor the time, sort out the questions 14 minutes per presenter for each graduate paper. So, um, conference, that the entire conference is recorded, as I mentioned at the start. We expect that you observe utmost professionalism in treating the speakers, moderators, and all participants. Please refrain from flooding the chat box with unnecessary and offensive remarks. We reserve the right, as the moderators, to kick you out of the session if your behavior is deemed inappropriate. Um, um, I hope my signal is fine. Andre, is Andre?
Hello, medyo choppy kasi on my end. I don't know with the rest. So, yan medyo choppy, Jillian.
Okay. So just a statement of please be reminded that the entire conference is recorded. We expect that you observe utmost respect and professionalism. Oh, wait, pardon me. Maybe this would help. Okay, maybe this would help. So, we you observe professionalism, as I said, and we reserve as the moderators to kick you out of the session if your behavior is deemed inappropriate. So, we will give certificates after the entire conference. Towards the end of each day, we will make available the evaluation form that for
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay, that's better, Jillian.
Okay, apologies. There is something wrong with the internet. Right. So, I hope it's alright with you guys that I'm keeping my camera off. Muna. So, okay. To finish off the reminders, we will give certificates after the entire conference. Towards the end of each day, we will make available the evaluation form for that particular session. So please stay towards the end of the uh, session. You must attend at least 3 sessions or days to receive a certificate. Please be reminded to use the same email address to which we will send that certificate in answering the evaluation form, and to use the same name which you wish to appear on the certificate. Lastly, please like and follow our Facebook pages to get updated with the conference and for future events. So there are 2 pages here. That is a Lecture, a graduate journal of philosophy, and another page, Society of the National Graduate Students of Philosophy. So, Okay, that's it for the reminders. And for tonight, we will be hearing from two speakers. One is from Marvin Einstein Mejaro, Sir Marvin Einstein Mejaro, with his the Paul event. And we will also be hearing from Mr. Anton Heinrich Rennesland with his paper entitled Sloterdijk and Interreligious Dialogue Against Extremist Reason, a polemic for 500 years of Christianity. So I will get the floor to Andre for introducing our speakers.
Hello, hello, Jillian. Thank you very much. And again, welcome to the fourth day of our conference. So, without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker for tonight. Uh, Sir Marvin Einstein S. Mejaro is a faculty member of the Learning Area of Philosophy of the UST Senior High School. In 2012, he was chosen as part of the delegates for Luzon in Tab- Taboa National Writers Festival held at Clark, Pampanga, and sponsored by the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. He was a fellow for fiction in Filipino in the 19th Iliga National Writers Workshop in 2012, the 14th IS National Writers Workshop in 2014, and the 12th Ateneo National Writers Workshop in 2014, and then the 15th UST National Writers Workshop in 2015. He is currently writing his dissertation on Alain Badiou and finishing his first novel, Mito ni Mithi. Once again presenting his paper entitled Badiou on the Paul Event and the Militancy of Christian Truth. We welcome Sir Marvin Einstein S. Mejaro.
Okay. Good evening po sa lahat. Thank you, Andre, and just like to give a special recognition to the chair of the department, Sir Joey Carino, and to my colleagues po sa senior high school. Good evening. So I would just like to share po my slide for today, for tonight. So ito po. Ayan. Na kita naman po siguro no Andre no kita naman yung paper.
Hi Doc. Yes po.
Apo. Hindi hindi pa ako tapos.
Sorry
Kaya
po.
okay. Oh. So
darating din naman po doon.
magalit yung mga panel. And so yung title ng work ko is actually yung pinaka final work would be yung pinaka final title is Badiou on the Fall Event and the Militancy of Christian Truth. So basically, I'll be using two works of Badiou here. The one is Saint Paul, the founder of Universalism, and a play written by Badiou himself as well, The Incident at Antioch. So I have two sections for this paper. The first section aims to articulate Badiou's notion of the fall event, and the second investigates the militancy of Christian truth as his intervention based from his own reading of Paul, which is non-theological but a secular articulation of the person as a figurehead, an archetype for what he calls as a rare subject of the event. During the foregoing, I aim to prove the thesis that Badiou's Pauline engagement reinforces a radical fidelity to a Christian truth that is distilled by an equally militant subject. And as I prove my thesis, so basically I just have two objectives in proving the premise. One is to show that a Badiouan reading of Paul provides an understanding of a Christianity that can be stripped of its clericalism towards a bare or naked view of a Christianity that works. Second is to follow the implication of such an understanding into contemporary praxis of being a Christian, especially in our own country and in our own time. So I'll be ending the paper by some kind of implication after studying the Paul event and militancy of Christian truth as applied in our own situation here in the Philippines. So let me first start my first section, the Paul event. By taking into account the whole corpus of Badiou, the engagement with St. Paul can be viewed, in fact, as a kind of surprise. Prior to a saint, Badiou only either engaged with a mathematician like that of Cantor, Cohen, or a novelist slash poet like that of Mallarmé or Beckett, as an example of the archetype of the rarity of the subject concerning the event. Hence, a Pauline engagement obviously diverts him from his heroes by entering a terrain that could steer his philosophy to regions far beyond its initial beginnings. Further, the sudden articulation could also place him, along with his works, at a disadvantage. Does he philosophize on religion? And if it were so, what is this? What is his contention? Only that the philosopher, at least according to himself, does not. In his work, St. Paul, the founder of Universalism, Badiou clarifies, basically, I have never really connected Paul with religion. It is not according to this register or to bear witness to any sort of faith or even anti-faith that I have for a long time been interested in him. For me, Paul is a poet thinker of the event, as well as the one who practices and states the inherent traits of what can be called as the militant figure. My intention really is neither historicizing nor exegetical. It is subjective through and through. There are two sides to this passage, I think. On one hand, if we were to believe Badiou in toto, he is merely being faithful to his own philosophy. On the other hand, if we were to cast a certain doubt, Badiou actually offers a bit unconsciously a potential theological notion on the idea of Christianity, as found in other researches as well, like that of Barclay in 2005, Ray Hunt in 2011, and Urbaniak in 2015. I argue that maintaining a non-theological perspective on the matter is sine qua non to uncovering his first original reading of Paul, and second, a unique understanding of the Christian truth, especially its militant character. Further, by providing an understanding of these concepts, not transcendentally but immanently, and by invoking an understanding of grace from the perspective of pure event, that this reading of St. Paul can be properly situated. Perhaps for those people who are not too familiar with Badiou, his idea of the event is simply the idea of a new beginning. So it's an idea of a kind of rupture which leads to a new beginning. So it starts first as something that is unrecognizable, but eventually it creates or ruptures towards something that is non-recognizable at first, but eventually will be recognized on the level of universality. That's why the book is called parang Paul is being looked by Badiou as one of the founders of universalism, which I'll be dealing with later. So akin to G or Cantor, who inspired him to appropriate that the mathematician's notion of inconsistent multiplicity as a key to his engagement with infinity and the impetus that pushed him to ground his own ontology, St. Paul for Badiou becomes a perfect example of a militant subjectivity that is faithful to the event, being in this context, the resurrection of Christ made clear to him on the road to Damascus. Hence, as mentioned, if Cantorian event provides him of the re-establishment of the role of mathematics in philosophy, specifically in ontology, or if the Mallarmé event provides him of an entirely new path away from the lyrical narrative poetry deemed to be as a crisis in verse, or if the Beckett event inaugurates an all-new perspective concerning the new possibility for a play within a play, this Paul event proves the possibility of a transition from singularity to universality. However, it does so not in a sense of universalism that places everything into uniform, but it's a kind of universalism that by being itself the site of the manifold of the difference, which Badiou calls to be the subject of division. Hence, Badiou hopes to maintain that this singular connection with Paul, that Paul who localizes a truth within a subjectivity that transgresses the law. I argue, that Badiou forces to sustain this via a redeclaration of what had been declared by Paul, for it not to be dissolved, just as he said, how culture comes to obliterate the art, because yung culture tries to replace the art. I think this is also uh, resembling what Adorno mentions. It is also how the word technology obliterates that of science, how the word management obliterates that of politics, how the word sexuality obliterates that of science. He adds, what does Paul want? Probably to drag the good news, the Gospels, out from the rigid enclosure within which its restriction to the Jewish community would confine it, but equally never to let it be determined by the available generalities, be they statist or ideological. Statist generality belongs to Roman legalism and to Roman citizenship in particular, to its conditions and rights associated with it. And although himself a Roman citizen and proud of it, Paul will never allow any legal categories to identify the Christian subject. Hence, this Paul event should be viewed as an entirely different dawn of an understanding of Christianity, where one is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, for all are one in Christ. No, as Badiou says in quoting the Galatians, it is seen secularly as a militant Christianity of truth. So I'll now go to my second part. So, as mentioned previously, the Christian truth for Badiou should be viewed as that which transgresses the Jewish law and that which disassociates itself from a Greek discourse. Crucial here is a critique that Christianity should not only be viewed to convince us, but also to make us as real converts of the faith. He provides two important reasons for this argument. Instead of focusing on mediation, Badiou sees Christ as the pure event. Christ is a coming. He is what interrupts the previous regime of discourses. Christ is in himself and for himself what happens to us. And what it is that happens to us thus, we are relieved of the law. This point reverberates a critique on the political Messiah that shall serve as the mediator between the old and the new kingdom. Hence, the militancy of Christian truth should be able to answer the question of who is Christ for you, not just on the level of knowledge, but more so on the level of fidelity to what happens, and hence it should be on the level of praxis. Christian truth demands the advent of a subject through faith. He says, for Paul, the event has not come to prove something. It is pure beginning. Christ's resurrection is neither an argument nor an accomplishment. This is the reason why the idea of conversion is crucial, because every convert is an actual giving birth of the subject. Badiou posits that one must depose the master and found the equality of sons. Apparent from these points is that Badiou goes into a field which, theologically speaking, could place him towards being misunderstood. For instance, one could see his resistance not to view the aspect of being a master or teacher on the level of apostleship, let alone the works of the prophet. Or he severs this line that connects reason and faith. Does Badiou read this pragmatically, and hence by separating reason and faith to a certain degree, he goes on to provide this kind of special diagnosis of what this actual content of our knowledge is? I argue that there is a basis to this motif, which is also found prior to his works. For instance, in his work Conditions, Badiou differentiates between truths on one hand and truth on the other hand. The former conveys the kinds of knowledge that proliferate just for the sake of mere pluralism, leading to a cycle of repetition. The latter, however, is the actual notion of truth, something connected to the event, and hence new, progressive, militant. Further, in this pursuit for the new, I argue that this polemical stance works as a kind of distillation of separating what is mere folly from an actual truth on Christianity. Thus, his position is a critique of the excess of historicism in terms of articulating the Christian truth, this clericalism of the words, and the dogmatism of assumptions far beyond the purity of a real event. That is the news of the resurrection of Christ, being itself enough and sufficient of the good news that should be preached, let alone conveyed to others. Badiou posits that the pure event is reducible to this. Christ died on the cross and resurrected. The event is grace, charis, thus it is neither a bequest nor a tradition nor a teaching. It is supernumerary relative to all this and presents itself as pure givenness. What Badiou suggests is that to free ourselves of the unnecessary lexicon on grace and to get rid of an attitude of a superflow religious confinements. Further, by a more humane understanding of what can be called as an evental grace, one can distill the truth of such an event from the opinions of recurring events and thereby, as a subject, redeclare what Paul already declared, not from ex cathedra, but from the seat of equality, becoming omnia omnibus. Via this route, Badiou sees universalism from the point of view of difference, noting that each subject localizes the evental grace not from the news of death, but from the news of life. Hence, in this superabundance of grace, says Badiou, it cannot be assigned to any whole, which is something that I quote from his book, page 78. What this implies is the idea that each militant subject carries a unique truth of Christianity that is universal in its very singularity. In fact, the universality comes to fore because of the actual singularity of what localizes it, based not on law, but on the event as fueled by faith. This division is necessary because it proves that the decentralization is a division that should be seen from the manifold of multiplicity, and that what threads them together is the event. In this context, based on Badiou's own investigation and even his confession of not providing a theological polemic, such an event is being Christ himself. Since for Badiou, Christ represents both the end of the law, which can only happen through love or agape. Therefore, the militancy of Christian truth is this unwavering declaration of this Christ event. This is what Paul followed during his lifetime and what he suggests even now, noting that his epistles were as contemporary as they were before and as they are now. Hence, to me, the Paul event is the Christ event. Interestingly, since the engagement of Badiou as a non-event, because he tries to look at this from the point of view of a secular perspective, and hence to him, in reality, this is not really an event because he is a non-believer. But being himself a non-believer and in his secular engagement of Paul, it is of notice that it unconsciously affects possible intersections of other theological reading, something I myself do not vouch because I try to read it consistently with how Badiou sees it, at least in this paper. But what I did is to weigh its implication, which I'll be saying later. The only difference being the approach as I maintain a Badiouan voice in its secular perspective, even as they are laden with unlikely theological undertones. At the end, Badiou sees Paul as the earthen vessel which is empty in itself without Christ. Hence, this Paul event is post-evental. We come to Badiou as he comes to Paul and as Paul comes to Christ. The militancy, therefore, of Christian truth is always what happens to us, to what happens next, and next until the coming of cannot be securely imagined, let alone anticipated. And so from all this discussion, I see these four implications, at least my preliminary discussion on Badiou's Paul event and the militancy of Christian truth. First is a careful evaluation into and or the legalism and clericalism that still perpetuate the church, and how should the faithful be able to check their own priests and bishops, pastors for that matter. Kasi ngayon, kahit hanggang ngayon, may paniniwala pa rin tayo na pag sinabi ng pare, tama, ganun. So, yun nga lang, nawawalan tingin ko ng checks and balances on that regard. A much realistic review of the thin line that separates a popular devotion that is still married in an uninformed tradition vis-a-vis an authentic celebration of feasts that go beyond mere spectacle of procession and lights. I think third is a true intervention concerning truths that we believe in the church by taking into account an actual participation as subjects in faith and not just as mere spectators. And finally, a real consideration of revolutions in faith, which is not political but evental, like that of community pantries happening right now. So with that, thank you po.
Okay, thank you. Um, siguro short check lang. Andre, am I still choppy?
Yeah, okay na. Malina na po tayo, Jillian.
Okay, apologies. So the floor is now open for questions. Um, feel free to message in the chat should you have any questions for Sir Einstein.
Thank you.
Mukhang nahihiya pa ata yung iba. Hmm. Siguro, to jumpstart, let me first inquire lang po.
Sige po.
Um, so, you mentioned po earlier, there's a distilling of truth, right? Do you see any maybe uh, concrete examples today that would showcase the need to distilling truth?
Mm, kasi actually yung engagement ko about distilling of the truth is more internal rather than external. So it's more of how the church discerns the truth. There is a possibility kasi of discerning the truth from a very knowledge-based discernment, no, like that of canon law, like that of the books that we've read, or parang the magisterium of the church. No, I think what Badiou is telling through Saint Paul is the possibility of a distillation that is based not on knowledge but is based on the purity of an event, meaning what happens after discovering the truth about Christ, no, kasi parang sinasabi niya na ang goal kasi ni Badiou, at tingin ko lang no, sa pagbasa niya kay Saint Paul ay parang bawasan no yung legalism na nakikita natin sa simbahan, no, at kung paano pa mas magiging bare at very essential no yung pagtingin doon sa Christianity, no, not just on the level of knowledge but also on the level of praxis, parang ganun.
Okay, thank you po. I see a question from Anton. Thank you, Kuya, for the presentation. Playfully thinking, I would want to ask, when we speak of a Paul event, could this also point to an experience of multiculturality, considering your mention of Paul at the crossroads of religion, Jew, Christian, and of societies, Roman or Gentiles?
Definitely, no, definitely. No, yung nabanggit ni Anton actually is the goal I think of Badiou. Parang kasi 'di ba yung first, kung mapapansin niyo yung parang first council no at Jerusalem, 'di ba? Parang medyo nakakatawa yung pinag-usapan nila doon, 'di ba? Parang dapat ba yung mga Kristiyano tuli o hindi, no? Parang gano'n. Pero actually ang tanong na yon boils down to the difference of culture. And so parang what you sees in Paul is a militant figure that tries to decentralize no what is centralized, and what is centralized is the culture of the Jew. So he tries to break away from that culture and tries to spread Christianity from all over the world, no? and uh, and of course that invites multiculturalism. Parang ganun. So yung nabanggit ni Sir Anton is actually, I agree with it.
So, okay, thank you. We have a question from Sir Jim saying here, thank you for your presentation, Sir Marvin. This is my simple question, sir. But you mention about Catholicism in particular as he talks about universalism? Thank you, sir.
Actually, hindi. No, wala kang makikitang Catholicism doon. So parang his discussion of Christianity is a discussion of Christianity in general. So at tingin ko okay din yon kasi I think parang yung Catholicism na alam natin ngayon would also have a different parang polemic and parang different idea, no? Base lang dun sa pagkakakita ko dun sa uh, argument niya. So there is none, no? There is no mention of Catholicism.
Okay. By the way, should Anton or Jim have further comments, feel free to input in the chat box. We have a question from Sir Christian. The Catholic Church in the Philippines is on its 500 years, approaching the truth not in theological manner. Would Badiou's eventual approach of Christian truth not taint the purity of Christian faith in its revelatory origin?
Tingin ko hindi. Kasi yung eventual approach naman kasi ni Badiou doon sa idea ng possibility ng at least revolution in terms of our faith is something that is parang it's something that germinates from past events, no? Kumbaga parang so yung nabanggit ko kanina na distillation, nangyayari lang din yung distillation kasi there is something that is being distilled. And so parang if the Catholic Church is pure of its approach to catharsis, no, in trying to cleanse itself as well, it will also lead towards a kind of eventual grace. Yung nga lang, ang sinasabi lang kasi dito at tingin ko yun din yung gusto ko patunayan din sa papel ay hindi kasi enough na magkaroon ng event. Yung rapture kasi ay kailangan ng isang subject. So, ibig sabihin, dito siguro sa Pilipinas, no, siguro isang tanong ay medyo nawawala siguro yung ganon. Konti lang siguro yung mga bishop siguro na may ganong klase ng parang militancy. No? Halimbawa si Father Bishop David, I think Bishop Pablo David is I think one of the examples. No? Pero para bang we're still missing the cardinal sin type, tingin ko, no, sa ngayon, parang ganun. Kasi pag sinabi kasing radical na sinasabi ni Badiou, totally kasi siya, it's parang some kind of a implosion siya. It's an implosion of a new, para siyang Vatican II style. So, although hindi ako masyadong maalam sa theology, but I think the PCP2, no, could be considered as that kind of implosion. Pero as of now, parang hindi na yata nasundan iyon. Yung pinakahuli na lang, yung parang yung kay Cardinal Rosales na parang yung naguhulog tayo ng mga piso-piso. Pero other than that, parang mukhang maganda ring pag-isipan natin kung ano pa yung pwedeng gawin ng simbahan. Pero kasi hindi kasi pwedeng biglain yun eh. Nangyayari siya kasi nang hindi inaasahan. So that is probably Badiou's idea on that rapture.
Okay, thank you po. Since no more questions are seated here, so we thank you po,
Thank you.
Sir Einstein, for presenting. Okay, so let's give a virtual round for Sir Einstein. Okay, so Andre, can you please introduce the next speaker? Thank you.
Okay, hello, good evening again. For our next speaker, Anton Heinrich Rennesland is an instructor and a PhD researcher of the Department of Philosophy in the University of Santo Tomas in Manila. He obtained his BA and MA, garnering summa cum laude, philosophy degrees from UST with both theses garnering a perfect score. He previously won top prize at the Don Isabel de los Reyes Philosophical Essay Writing Contest, sponsored by the Philosophical Association of the Philippines on on new themes for Filipino philosophy. He is a member of various philosophical organizations and has taken an active part in national and international conferences in Asia, Australia, and in Europe. He has publications in journals along with forthcoming book chapters with Routledge and the Cambridge Scholars on his fields of interest, Friedrich Nietzsche, Peter Sloterdijk, and comparative and multicultural philosophy. Presenting his paper entitled Sloterdijk and the Interreligious Dialogue Against Extremist Reason, a polemic for Christianity's quincentennial anniversary. Once again, we welcome Sir Anton Heinrich Rennesland. Thank you.
Salamat. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Jillian. Welcome po lahat to our conference. Uh, I'll just share my. I didn't prepare a slideshow presentation because I thought of just sharing the paper because for time constraints. Uh, so what I do in my paper basically is to talk about. I follow rather Sloterdijk's idea of spherology, and on that I work on dialogue. Let me just begin. Durkheim's sociological definition of religion as a unified system of beliefs and so on highlights how religion is a collective experience of a people bounded by certain regulations. This institution plays a dominant part in that in people's identification. This plays part of what Sloterdijk considers as spherology sanctioned by immunitary reason. So the history of humanity can be recounted as gradations in our sphere formation. In a social sense, this may be identified through first the family, a bigger community, until ultimately, as contemporary society portrays, the global community. So that process of spheres, so to speak. So the family, you have a bigger society, and then you have, again, the global community. Since this sphere formation activity refers to actual space, immunitary reason's role is protectionism. How are we able to build those spheres if not to protect them, to immunize them? So that's the idea of immunitary reason. Immunization stands as identifying, establishing, and defending the spaces that are common to a particular people, something neatly represented by culture with religion and language as two facets among others. So I explicitly mention religion and language because those are the two things I talk about here. First, on religion. A macro narrative of this spherology is evident with how religion took part of immunization in history. For the most part of our history as a species, Homo sapiens, we were foragers, and this I get from Yuval Hariri. We were foragers, only eventually learning how to settle and domesticate. We found a home, the Latin domus, home, for those of you who know Latin. Playfully thinking, it is rather peculiar that we use the word domesticate than habituate. The latter from habitare, meaning to dwell, while the former from the verb domare, meaning to tame. Playfully, again, in finding a home, in creating meaning for this domestication, we have tamed the species. Hariri, this is Hariri. Due to our domestication, we have survived according to how we have been able to immunize our spheres. So in settling down in certain areas, we've been able to domesticate, to find, to plant crops and so on. And we've developed because of that as a species. Coincidental to our taming was the emergence of religion, Hariri points out, as a search for metaphysical optimism, meaning assurance, safety within the bounds of one's immediate surroundings. So in the course of human history, Hariri points that we see first the emergence of localized religions like Egyptian gods and goddesses, Greek, Romans, and so on. This fitted perfectly well for religious immunization, offers an embodiment of metaphysical optimism through rituals that save the congregation from chaos. Religious rites make most sense to the believer who has ascribed to such the consolation of the day of resurrection. So I'm trying to jump the narrative to the emergence later on of monotheism, of monotheistic religions, which common to which rather is the day of resurrection. So Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, we all believe in that day of resurrection. I'm skipping some parts. I'm trying to point out that this metaphysical optimism that religion is able to provide also gives us a glimpse of extremist reason, as I will try to point out in the history of Christianity. The church found herself granting the rights of the world to her loyal subjects with a papal bull in Intercetera that divided the world to the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. The circumnavigation of the globe, of which the Philippines was part of with Fernando de Magallanes' 1521 arrival, buttressed an extremizing reason and enthused the passion of religious zealots. It provided a new conquest of an even greater sphere. So it's not just that sphere of the old world, so to speak, but we realize that there is a much greater sphere, literally. The world is an orb worthy of heated conquest, resulting in, and this is Sloterdijk, his book, God's Zeal, The Battle of Three Monotheisms. This is the title of the book. Uh, Resulting in a theological cosmological litany in which the spheric attributes are studied ad majorem gloriam globi. Parenthetically, I picked up on this. Parenthetically, what later sought to be a counter-Reformation religious orders, the Society of Jesus, eventually experienced the harshness of this metaphysical optimism. With the monarch's zeal of ad majorem gloriam globi, for the greater glory of the globi, it comes to no surprise that the Society of Jesus came under fire with their firm conviction of ad majorem gloriam Dei. That's the motto of the Jesuits, earning the irk of monarchs across the old world and their expansion relative success in the new world, notably China. Their motto was the grain of salt, and the very order that has a fourth vow of obedience to the Pope was expelled from entire Christendom by the Supreme Pontiff, who stood as the mere satisfier of the crown's wishes. And this was the actual words of the Pope then. With such a move, extremist reason took firm root within the Christian narrative. For micro-narrative of extremist reason, I localized this discussion of Christianity's arrival to the Philippines by engaging Dr. Ko's treatment of this. He highlights the different approaches of the Catholic Church in evangelizing China and the Philippines, but is ambiguous, I would say, if not misled. For on the one hand, he claims that it was literally a triumphalistic march of a dominant Western Catholic culture inward the islands, signifying an evangelization cum Hispanization through cross and sword. Yet he also says that the Catholicism which the Filipinos continue to practice now is the very kind of Catholicism brought to them by the colonizers some 500 years ago. He portrays the generally unproblematic evangelization in the Philippines through coercion, which was unsuccessfully carried out in China. Well, we know the story of Mateo Ricci. The difference is already obvious. The Jesuits' attempt in China was through enculturation because, as Dr. Ko maintains, the Chinese culture was already formed, while religious orders such as the Augustinians and the Dominicans came to the Philippines with a sense of evangelization as Hispanization. We may opine that immunization among the islands on the Western Pacific was not as strong as that in mainland Asia. Dr. Ko juxtaposes the degree of the two cultures' immunization. There was no single sovereign, I quote him, that ruled the entire archipelago that is now collectively known to be the Philippines. There were Agtas, Ifugaos, Ivatans, Tibolis, Lumads, and countless communities ruled by tribal chiefs, each having its own animistic religion, tribal customs, rites, myths, legends. But those were all that was, for the islands were never unified nor existed as a state or a country like China, India, Japan, or Khmer. China was already a well-established culture and civilization when the Western colonizers and evangelizers came to the East. Immunization bears semblance to political armament, and a unifying power was absent in the islands. Yeah, we admit this, which was common to the four states mentioned: the imperial dynasties of China and Japan, the Mughal Empire, and the Khmer Empire. However, such a unifying power does not assure protection from factions and other colonial threats. Cambodia fell under French protection, the French protectorate of Cambodia. Eventually, it was colonized by France. India under Portugal, the Netherlands, and eventually Great Britain. The Bakufu was forced to open the Japanese Empire following the Great Qing Empire's defeat in the Opium Wars. Yet beyond the political power, immunization indicates a common cultural identity, something which Dr. Ko indicates to be absent from the various tribal groups scattered across the islands. Parenthetically, I just have something with his mention of Lumads because he refers to Lumads as a specific ethnic group, but we know it's a collective term, which should be properly called as indigenous people. By situating his narrative this way, it becomes obvious that the indigenous people were no match culturally, more so politically, to the evangelization, Hispanization that started in 1521 that ushered that triumphalistic march. The zeal in this conquest for the islands and by extension Asia was engendered by a metaphysical optimism stemming from something deeper. Dr. Ko opines it as European confidence from a belief that the search for the way to truth had ended in the old world, paving the age of exploration, conquest, and colonization beyond its borders. He contends a self-assurance of European immunary reason qua the bankruptcy of truth-finding there, which propelled the colonizers to the New World. Although I do not fully agree with his reading, we arrive at a similar idea that such a move was an attempt at immunizing the global sphere because of the perceived self-immunization already in the old world. Yet the contradiction I seek to point out is his second claim that the Philippine joviality in celebrating our cultural identity through religious fiestas, such as those dedicated to saints, patronesses, or even greater celebrations to Christ, the Santo Niño, the Nazareno, or to the Blessed Virgin Mary, uh, is exactly the same as what came before. It seems he outwardly equates the Philippine sense of identity indistinguishable from Christianity's viewpoint, which obviously, although yes, we could claim we're majority Christian, majority of the population is Christian, which would earn criticism from indigenous people more or Muslims in the country, considering that Islam came prior to Christianity. However, I argue that this is a simplistic narrative. Naively, he confuses two kinds of Christianity we distinguish from the advantages of sociology and phenomenology. Religion that organize the people and religion that is something experienced. Uh, Dr. Carino precisely accentuated how the Christianity which arrived to the islands was zealotic, not primarily due to Christ's final command from the Gospel of Matthew of making disciples of all nations, but due to political and economic motivations. This reminds us of Sloterdijk's consideration that the motives of Christian missionary success should be interpreted more critically than mere global moral improvement, but as going on the offensive by fleeing from the world. The positions of world and church can be respectively read as that between foreign and inoculated. The Christianity that arrived in 1521 was zealotic due to immunary reason, a desire to inoculate the foreign. We therefore are left to wonder if this is the same zeal of the devotees of the Black Nazarene or the La Naval. In celebrating the quincentenary of Christianity's arrival, we're left to ponder the source of that joviality we have today. The immunization that the faith secured before contribute to the sociological understanding of religion, as I have devoted the earlier part of this essay on. Whereas what we celebrate today signifies an understanding of that second aspect, that phenomenological understanding of the faith. By the way, I get that from Niklas Luhmann. He distinguishes that in his book. Earlier, I have hinted how religion quells the drive rather, for meaning formation. Religious experiences, such as events of meaning formation, resounds this. However, Luhmann notes that even if meaning can be actualized at the point where an operation is using meaning, the medium as such remains invisible. Even if we are able to verbalize events, verbalizing as the medium between ourselves and the world, so language as that mediation between ourselves and the world, uh, the medium of meaning formation as an impetus for existence remains evanescent. Words could not really articulate everything about it. We are not able to precisely articulate all experiences, more so those that provide meaning for ourselves, or even that provide social ontology. I would want to first focus on the significance of language. Giorgio Agamben links being to language. To be human is to be able to use language as our connection to the world. Such is the esteem from an ontological perspective that may be attributed to letters, while at the same time assert its domesticating capacity. I quote from Sloterdijk: "The Latin theme of humanism is thus the de-bestialization of the human being, and its latent thesis runs, right reading tames." Right reading domesticates the individual, educates, localizes the person to an immediate sphere. Playfully, we may even consider one's baptism of language that initiates the child into a single perspective, dramatically domesticating the child's relation with reality by providing the means with which life may be articulated. Such a baptism within a single worldview is more aligned to the Jewish celebration of Shavuot than the Christian Pentecost, despite both of them falling on the 50th day after Passover. We witness here not a celebration of the multiplicity of tongues, but a singularity of perspectives. The child's language debut provides the grammar to the child's experience, which had the word grammar had a medieval implication exposed through its etymology that whoever could read and write could easily manage other kinds of impossible things too. The ability to use language had a synonymous magical capacity to do what is impossible. This grammar was tied to a domestication and, as presented above, the formation of immunological zones. At this point, we are linked to the second aspect of culture, which plays part of immunitary reason. The phenomenological aspect of religion, which I like to present here, is via a treatment of language. Among the three monotheist religions, it is only Christianity which does not associate its religio-cultural identity to language. Although the language used by Jews and Muslims have developed through time, the religious identity is closely linked to the language spoken by God. Hebrew and Arabic. Among the languages of the three monotheisms, it is easily identifiable which is based on development. Classical Hebrew and Classical Arabic are the languages of the Torah and the Quran. While if we say Classical Latin, we refer to the writings of Cicero, Caesar, Virgil, and Horace. Such description of classical to the Roman language showcases not simply a source of religious convictions, but of humanist ideas, without which Greek philosophy would not have developed further, and humanism and Latin philosophical discourses of the medieval times, uh, would fail to reach contemporary society. The Renaissance was a rebirth of Latin humanism of the classical text. Already by this stone, we sense the difference of Christianity from Islam in language appropriation. I use Islam because in the Philippines, it's Christianity and Islam, and that's why that's where I'll end later. This difference was further emphasized in history as how Islamic expansionism reached its peak with the Ottoman Empire prior to Christianity's reassertion of dominance through cross and sword. What propounded Christianity's aggressive front was the language of expansion via the Enlightenment, which amounted to a continuation of Christianity by rationalist and historico-philosophical means by virtue of its ideological or propagandistic design. The actual experience of the Philippines in its evangelization testifies this as an embrace of modernity. Indeed, this is where I agree with Dr. Ko. What was absent in the country was a homogenizing factor prior to foreign intervention. However, where we differ is where we draw the boundary between foreign and familiar. Are we all not foreign to other groups? While the Europeans faced a united China, Japan, India, and Khmer, these nations were once composed of groups foreign to each other, tribes foreign to each other, only having been immunized, read colonized, by an even greater immunized clan, so one tribe taking control over the other. What stood as the immunizing factor in the country, the Philippines, was cross and sword. This catapulted the formation of a collective consciousness among the people we would rightly identify as Filipino, bearing testament to the unifying inoculation effected by our baptism into Hispanidad. I mean, the name Filipino, Felipe. This identity of Hispanidad was then, as Ilustrados would seek to assert later in the history of the Philippines, the entry of the nation into the global sphere, a common language to interact with each other, a language to articulate the Philippine experience. Christianity's language in its expansion was not of strict traditionalism as one might immediately associate to it, but rather I would say an embrace of modernity, a desire for knowledge, establishment of universities, a desire for medical advancement, hospitals, prevailing governance, barrios, town halls, that reduction system, and of course, all of these done for God's zeal, our beautiful churches. If the church, or Catholic Church, had not embraced this modern language in their approach to the islands, then friars should not have been engaged in the founding of these institutions to support a culturally vulnerable, or some would even say backward, if we follow Dr. Ko's argument, people. Their immunization was done in the sole language they knew. The way the Spaniards immunized the Philippines, colonized the Philippines, Christianized the Philippines was done in the language they knew, and thus the Hispanization of the people of Las Islas Filipinas. Um, 500 years of Christianity in the country, maybe I could read this. In anticipation of the quincentennial anniversary, the CBCP marked 2020 as the year of ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, and the indigenous people with the theme Dialogue Towards Harmony, which I here in this paper present against the backdrop of the Holy Father's Fratelli Tutti and Sloterdijk's post-Zelotic narrative. With religion's narrative presented above, Christianity rather, we are left to ponder how extremist reason is manifest in the Philippines beyond already perceived political squabbles. Its emergence in the global sphere Sloterdijk portrays is due to the inability to dialogue outside one's immunized sphere, resorting instead to consistent applications of high cultural grammar, which was based on the rigid combination of a monovalent ontology and bivalent logic. So, despite the fact that we are in a globalized society, uh, we have failed really to immunize it, so to speak. That we have I mean populism and all of these things. Sort of like would say we see how society, how the global sphere has become formal, not really a sphere, but it's just like a foam. It just pops. This zeal to impose on everything foreign a brand of vulnerability, vulnerable to the homogenizing effects of one's own prophetic mission, fails to recognize the potency of such exposure to the other. Dr. Carino dwells on this phenomenological experience of Christianity. Through the islands' baptism in 1521, we have been secured not the gospel of Christ, but the embrace of forgetfulness. He says, pagtalikod sa gunita. Gaya ng modernidad, I quote, inakala ng mga misyonero na kaya nilang maglunsad ng bagong panahon na walang nililingon ng kahapon. At gaya rin ng modernidad, inasahan nila na ang hinaharap sa anyo ng pangakong kaligtasan ay magaganap bilang tadhana ng kasaysayan. In his narrative, Dr. Carino, is it articulated how Christianity and the Enlightenment merged on a palpable level in its arrival to the Philippines 500 years ago. The lesser immunized sphere of the island natives was exposed and was simply too vulnerable to the Spanish expansionists' cross and sword, baptizing them into the grammar of a then already extreming reason. Harmony that is secured not through dialogue, but through homogeneity. 500 years of Christianity in the country and yet a consistent narrative of true encounter of the faith cannot be posited without resort to zealotism or blind faith. The Holy Father even affirms this through his observation on the global regress into extremist reason expressed in populist support or resentful nationalism, but above all the regress of reason to forgetfulness, the weakening of historical consciousness. Fratelli Tutti. This is in Fratelli Tutti. Emphatic of the Holy Father to be in underscoring something Heidegger qualifies as characteristic of Western metaphysics, which Dasein regresses in its everydayness. Heidegger explains that the arbitrary division ramified by the Cartesian separation of ego and everything not ego causes a forgetfulness of something even prior to ego, being. This is Heidegger. In our case of dialogue, it is the forgetfulness of the arbitrariness of the immunized sphere that makes us think that what is outside of us is foreign. The harmony that one gets from this forgetfulness is really ephemeral, for true harmony comes from an event. Perhaps this is what John Caputo refers to when he heralds a theology of event, recounting the illustrations at times paradoxical of the kingdom of God, inviting those not worthy to the banquet, yet casting out the one underdressed, or even praise for the foreign Samaritan neighbor, and the admonition that there is nothing external that defiles the person, yet immediately followed by the disdain for the unclean foreign dog, the woman. The advent of extremist reason in religion was precisely for homogeneous harmony, yet the Church is mindful that this should not be the way. Second Vatican Council and a lot of documents. Hospitality has become the more apt approach in our sphere formation. This is even pushed forward by Pope Francis' encyclical inspired by his namesake. Visions of fraternal society are not new for Christianity, even in evident in the name Catholicos, universal, and represented above all by the very papacy marked with interculturality. Neither Christ nor the first pope was Roman, yet the eternal city is foreign to both, as it is in Rome. Or that the title Pontifex Maximus was formerly designated to the chief priest in ancient Roman culture, giving flesh to the dichotomy of the Pontifex and God, repaying to Caesar, who at time was the Pontifex Maximus, what is his due, and to God what is. Words of Christ. Dialogue with transculturality or interculturality plays a fundamental role at heart of Christianity, and so it is an extremely elaborate account how this primarily intercultural sphere, I mean, how Christianity, that is by its nature very intercultural, became a religion that dominated with cross and sword. We ought to be mindful once more of what lies at heart of our sphere formation. Perhaps rather surprising, the current Pontifex Maximus declared how God is not the center of the orb we have fetishized much. God did not want an idol to be at the center of the world but man, men and women who would keep the world going with their work. One needs to cite the exact words, lest the zealot be left in disbelief. Pope Francis wishes to put humanity on stage and not merely empty idols that dominated extremist reasons of both past and present. With humanity on stage, we are reminded of its expression capacity through language. However, language is not simply the ability to talk, but it hints at a deeper intimacy of being, the allowance for an event to happen, I guess. A post-zeal narrative is not simply a question of the ability for ecumenism or interreligious dialogue, but a move beyond the nihilism masked by religious zealotry, the nihilism behind blind faith, which is precisely characteristic of extremist reason. It should go beyond the bifurcating logic of primitive sphere formation. What seems to be a new religious question is in fact the return of the social question on a global biopolitical level. We are once more brought back to the global sphere, yet with a different attitude, hospitality. This etymologically denotes a friendliness towards others, the Latin hospitalitas. However, ironically, it resounds hostis, enemy, and potens, power. John Caputo says, which connote having the power of the master of the house over the guest. The obvious contradiction is contained in an even deeper etymological root. The Latin hospes causes a tug in our translation as it means, and this is quite funny, it means guest, host, friend, but at the same time stranger or even foreigner. The word hospes. One immunizes oneself from the stranger, yet one pulls down these walls to let the friend in. But at the end, the host is the guest, the stranger the friend. As a polemic for Christianity's quincentenary, we are offered some consolation with the celebrated status hospitality has within Philippine culture. Yet sadly, it is almost immediately associated to the service industry. This type of hospitality, I argue, remains superficial if it is unable to combat extremist reason or social apathy. Dr. Reyes goes at length to discuss Filipino virtues, elevating kabutihang loob as a root paradigm of culture, the sheer beauty of the will, whereas hiya as a passion leads one to an uncomfortable state, which for brevity is closer to being shamed than virtue propriety. Napahiya versus kahihiyan. If hospitality indeed springs from the kindness of our will and sensitivity towards others, he says hiya as a virtue, then that is cause for celebration. Yet if done from embarrassment and fear of being left behind, then matter of alarm. We're only left to wonder how the Christian missionaries were successful in explaining to the natives what baptism and salvation are. That on April 14, just some 2 weeks since their arrival, the first baptisms were held. Raha Humabon became Carlos, and his wife Hara Juana. We will never know what really made them aspire for baptism, out of hospitality or fear, but this marked the start of a new high grammar in the islands that eventually became the Philippines, the grammar that we today celebrate. If indeed the exact Christianity that came to our shores 500 years ago is the identity of Filipinos today, then perhaps religion's sociological function has run its course, and extremism is fundamentally part of our very reason, as the nihilistic undertone even to social and political pathologies. And we could go on and on that. However, at the crossroads of our celebration, we ought to remember the vulnerability of historical consciousness. I quote, ang isang bayan na pinagkaitan ng gunita ay ulila ng kanyang simula. Isa itong bihag sa loob ng muog ng ligid ng tandang pananong. Ang kanyang pag-iral ay walang patlang ng paghahanap. Ang kaluluwa niya ay isang kalawakan ng hindi mapanatag na paghahangad. As we are only left with scraps of what can simply be gleaned as pre-Hispanidad consciousness, this should propel us to cherish even further the hospitality that we pride as a Filipino trait. Perhaps pondering on our hospitality is a new language we were never fully able to master that now allows us a breeze of fresh air. This fresh air that dusts out the consciousness, our consciousness, that has simply forgotten. Moving forward, after 500 years, requires us to dialogue out the Christian tradition. We not just out of the Christian tradition, but dialoguing this Christianity outward. We need to go no further. For the Philippines, the Muslim faith arrived even earlier than Christianity. Perhaps we can start with them. Okay, so that's the end. Thanks for listening.
Okay. Thank you, Sir Anton. So, again, we're opening the floor for questions. So, should you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the chat box. Siguro yung iba nagtatype pa dyan. Maybe I can ask a question. So, I'm not really, yes, Anton, hi. I'm not really familiar with Sloterdijk, so maybe I might have a wrong interpretation of this, so feel free to correct me. So, can you elaborate a bit when it comes to the concept of immunization? What are the dangers of unimmunized spheres?
Of unimmunized or of unimmunized? I'm sorry.
Unimmunized.
Unimmunized. Well, it's not really something dangerous, but that's just how humanity progressed. I mean, in his volume 2 of that spherology, he has a spheres trilogy. In volume 2, he talks about how that's just the course of human society. I mean, the micro narrative, he says, the first community of the human person and the embryo in the tummy of the mother. But on a macro scale, that's why I link it to Hariri, because that's just how society progressed. We immunized those spheres that aren't immunized. That's why in the earlier part of the paper, the first part, I said, so from family to civil society, and today we have reached that global sphere. That's just the progression of society. Sloterdijk would say that's just immutary reason. That's just how reason operates, to immunize our sphere. So what are the dangers of an unimmunized sphere? There's precisely no danger. Well, we could say from a biological point of view. From a biological point of view, there is that danger that we get sick, as the pandemic has shown us. But in terms of culture, what is the danger of being unimmunized? Precisely of being colonized, of being immunized by something greater. That's why towards the end, I said we only have scraps of a pre-Hispanidad consciousness. I'm not heralding a return to that pre-Hispanidad because it's intrinsically part already of what it is to be a Filipino. We cannot discredit 300 plus years, 360 plus years of being part of that immunization. That's why arguably we could say Rizal wasn't arguing for freedom from the Spaniard and so on and so forth. What are the dangers of being unimmunized? Precisely the colonizer, of being immunized by someone else.
Okay, thank you Anton,
Oh,
for clarifying that.
no.
Sorry, lag ata yung video ko. Anyway, so there's a question here from Sir Christian. With the Christianity and with churches' continuous mission and evangelization, what language should be used so as to be effective in receiving the faith and accept its purity, aside from language of hospitality and conversion?
Well, on the one hand, we could talk about like people just like all of us. We could talk about the church at that level, or we could talk about the church from the point of view of the hierarchy of the church. Uh, well, I would just say the language of hospitality. I think that's the language of the Second Vatican Council. At least that's how I read it. The whole idea of aggiornamento, isn't it? Of John the 23rd, of Saint John the 23rd. Uh, that I mean, that's like what I mentioned to Doc Sagut last Monday. That's why I appreciate actually Theophorus how it's teached in UST. It's the encounter of the faith, which sometimes we haven't we haven't I mean, even us baptized Christians have really understood the faith. It's not about the purity of it, but it's the experience of the faith itself. That we could say with the words of St. Paul, the love of Christ, Caritas Christi urget nos, impels us to really bear witness. With the Second Vatican Council, how I see it, it's not anymore the age of solely of just the missionaries of in religious orders, but of bearing witness to the gospel. And then we scratch our heads why our students in UST join yung mga victory churches. What is going wrong? That within a Catholic institution, we have students who are unable to encounter the faith. That resort to that they find the faith sa mga victory churches and yung mga worship na ganun. Considering the fact that we have yung mga couples for Christ, youth for Christ, even organizations at that way. I mean, just the language of dialogue. Maybe there is something on from our point of view na hindi natin talagang nagagawa. We haven't been able to articulate for ourselves. Kaya we cannot communicate it. But I don't want naman to seem very pessimistic na parang, well, what we cannot say, we just leave to the recesses of history. But I mean, that's why I find it very, very parang potent, kumbaga. I find it very potent to have that sense of intercultural dialogue or interreligious dialogue, because we could transmit things even without saying, and that we've learned from Chan Buddhism, eventually in Japan, Zen Buddhism. But why have we been really fixated with language? Considering the fact that we did not have a single language as a church. We had Jewish, and then we had Hebrew, and then we had Greek, the New Testament, and then later on Latin. And then with the Second Vatican Council, we had how do you call that? Yung languages, local languages, I forgot the term. Yun lang, vernacular, thank you. Yung mga vernacular languages. If you'd ask me, sorry, this is a long response, pero I couldn't I couldn't pinpoint a certain language. The best I could say so far is just hospitality and maybe bearing witness.
Okay.
Yeah, bearing witness.
So, yeah, there was a response from Sir Christian thanking you. It's true, actually, the encounter of Christ predisposed by witnessing express Christian charity. Yeah. So, we have another question for you, sir, from Sir Kim. Are you now saying that religion is built upon the human experience of self-transcendence rather than human cognition or cultural discourses?
Kim, I don't really see how the two are opposed to each other. The experience of self-transcendence is not something even, I mean, we don't even talk about it in the Christian religion. It's something more talked about in other religions than human cognition. Well, I would say, well, in the Christian sense, religion is founded. I would, or, as a Christian myself, I would say Christianity or religion, that religious experience is founded on Christ, on our tradition, the whole with a capital T. I'm not saying anything new, actually. I'm not disclaiming our tradition. But I'm just pointing out the fact that of how we have come to understand Christianity, how we have come to understand religion. Now, at 500 years, and this I tell always, I tell all of my students, uh, look at us. Why is it like that? Not to, I would say, echoing the words of Brother Abulad, it's not ethics that failed the Philippines. It's not Christianity that failed us, but it is us who failed it. Something so beautiful, something with such a historical traditional weight, has become like this. Maybe it's because we haven't learned to understand really what the faith is. Maybe okay, yeah. So it's maybe it's just us who haven't understand what the faith is.
Okay, so are there any questions left for Mr. Anton? Seems as if okay na. Okay, so we thank you, Sir Anton, for presenting tonight.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay, so maybe Andre has a few words for us.
Okay, everyone. As already sent in the chat box, the evaluation for this day is already open for. Yeah, it's already open. You can just go to the chat box and kindly answer the form for the certificate. And of course, sorry kung narinig niyo po yung balita. Pero ayun po, maybe perhaps remind everyone, of course, that our last day of the conference will start at 4 o'clock p.m. So ayun po, kindly tell your friends na rin po siguro for the last for the last day of our conference. Yan po. Jillian, kung meron pa po.
Okay, so thank you, Andre. To echo what Andre said, the start of our conference tomorrow would be at 4 p.m. This is to give way for the work in progress to be conducted later tomorrow. So, okay, that concludes for tonight's presentations. Thank you everyone for attending tonight. And thank you as well for the presenters. As Andre said, the evaluation is just there. Feel free to fill it out. And that's it for tonight. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. See you all tomorrow.
Salamat po. Thank you po.